Stacy, and welcome to How Did We Get Here, where we talk about some of the craziest stories throughout history and try to figure out how anyone has ever gotten to this point. So because of the timing, I thought it was only fitting that we do a Halloween case, and this one is not only shocking, but pretty tragic. As a kid, I never really celebrated Halloween. My parents were immigrants, but also very spiritual. So they just never celebrated it, and it just didn't really exist to them, and the concept just flew over their head. They didn't get it, and so we didn't celebrate it. I was never allowed to dress up unless it was for some sort of school event, and I most definitely was not allowed to go trick-or-treating. They always heard all these horror stories of kids in America getting kidnapped and killed and poisoned and yada yada yada. So the idea of getting candy from strangers throughout the neighborhood and throughout the city was like absolutely not. So we never did it. So the next day at school, every Halloween, you would always see these kids come in with bags and bags of candy. I'm not gonna lie, as a kid, I was a little jealous, but now as a grown adult, it is what it is. You get over it. And honestly, it's kind of funny to think about. So, this case specifically, I think it's a great example of every parent's fear when it comes to Halloween. And I think if my parents would have heard about this specifically, they would have just never allowed us to eat candy again. So, let's get started, shall we? So, it's a dark and stormy night on October 31st, 1974. Cliche, I know. We're in Deer Park, Texas with the O'Brien family, Ronald and Dianine O'Brien, and their two kids, Timothy and Elizabeth, ages 8 and 5. So on Halloween night, Ronald was planning on taking his kids out to go trick-or-treating, and they decide to go to their family friend's, Jimmy Bates' house to have dinner first, and then all of their kids were going to get together and they were going to take them trick-or-treating around the neighborhood. Jimmy and Ronald eat dinner. After everyone's done, they decide they're going to start going trick-or-treating. Like I said, it was raining that night, and so they decided to only go to 2 neighborhoods. While trick-or-treating, they passed by a house where all the lights were off. But, the kids were insistent on getting candy from every house, so they decided to knock on the door anyways. After a while, the kids realize that nobody's coming out. They're not getting candy, and they kind of just start running off to go to the next house. Jimmy starts to chase after them after they left, and Ronald is left alone at the house. He meets up with the kids a few minutes later and comes back with 5 21-inch pixie sticks that he says he got from that house. He gives one to each of the kids, has one left over, and sees a kid that he recognizes from their church and decides he's going to give him the last pixie stick. Trick-or-treating ends, they got enough candy, it's raining, and they decide to go home. When they get home, Timothy and Elizabeth immediately want to start eating their Halloween candy and are looking at everything, and Ronald tells them, you're only allowed to eat 1 piece of candy before you go to bed. It's late, you're not going to have this sugar rush when you're supposed to go to sleep. So Timothy decides he's going to eat the pixie stick. And immediately Timothy is eating it and he complains that it tastes weird. It tastes funny. And they think maybe it's just some old candy. Throw it out and you're not going to eat it. And then Timothy starts complaining of a stomach ache. He goes to the bathroom and starts violently throwing up. They call the ambulance to try to get Timothy better, but by the time he got to the hospital, he had died. Hearing this, the town goes into hysteria. Parents are throwing out all their kids' Halloween candy, and some parents are deciding to just bring it straight to the police station to get it checked for anything. The whole town is panicking, and police need to figure this case out immediately. So how did we get here? So on this case is Harris County's prosecutor, Mike Hinton. He has a hunch pretty much immediately, calls the medical examiner, and asks the medical examiner to smell Timothy's breath. Immediately, he says it smells like almonds. And if you didn't know, the smell of bitter almonds is associated with cyanide. It has a lot to do with some science and chemistry stuff that I am not qualified in any sort of way to describe. So if you want to learn a little bit more about that and you're interested in chemistry, I definitely recommend researching a little bit more. After more investigation into Timothy's autopsy, it showed that it was indeed cyanide that killed him. And not only did he have cyanide in his system, he had more than enough cyanide to kill 2 grown adults. An 8-year-old had enough cyanide to kill 2 grown adults. He didn't stand a chance, unfortunately. There was absolutely no way they could have saved him in that case. So the police start investigating further, and immediately their priority is to collect the remaining pixie sticks that were given out to the kids. So we have one that went to Elizabeth, Timothy's daughter. We have the other 2 that went to Jimmy's kids. And then the last one is the one that he gave out to the kid from his church. Ronald said he doesn't really remember who he gave it to. He just remembers seeing the kid walk by, recognizing him, and deciding to give it to him. Now they're really on the hunt, and they call pretty much a bunch of parents, and the parents of the boy are absolutely panicking. They're looking into his kid's bag to try to find this last missing pixie stick, and it's not there. So they run upstairs to his bedroom and walk in, and what do they see? There's a kid asleep with a pixie stick in his hand. Not opened, just in his hand, laying in bed. So this kid was trying to get the pixie stick open, but it was stapled shut, and so he couldn't get it open, and after struggling for a while, he just fell asleep with it in his hand. I cannot imagine being a parent and realizing how much of a close call that is. Now they have all the pixie sticks, and when they open them up, they investigate them. The top 2-inch or 2 of each of the pixie sticks were topped with cyanide and then stapled shut. So this is what Timothy consumed, and that killed him. He pretty much ate straight cyanide and didn't even get to the pixie stick. On November 4th, Timothy gets buried, and police start to question Ronald, how he got these pixie sticks and what house it was, but he doesn't remember. Go as far as taking Ronald into the neighborhood to figure out to try to narrow down which exact house it was. But Ronald again says he doesn't remember. All he saw was someone sticking their hand through the door, handing him 5 pixie sticks, and then shutting it. All he knew was that it was a person with a hairy hand, which again doesn't tell you anything. And police are starting to get suspicious because the night of them trick-or-treating, it was raining, so they only went to 2 neighborhoods for trick-or-treating. So it's really not a big range of houses it's not a lot to try to narrow down. You really don't. You have 2 streets to look for and you can't remember. So once the police realized they were getting nowhere, they started to put a lot of pressure on Ronald, and they take him to this neighborhood again. And all of a sudden, Ronald's memory was jogged, and he says he remembers the house. He points to one, and they were able to find the owner, Courtney Melvin. So Courtney Melvin was not home at the time, so they go to his place of work and immediately arrest him right then and there in front of all of his colleagues. So, case closed, right? You would think. But Courtney had an alibi, a solid, airtight alibi. That night, he was at work, and they had the timesheets, and all his coworkers were also able to confirm that he was indeed at work that night. And then his wife and kids were all at home with the lights off because at that point, they had run out of Halloween candy, and so that's why they turned off the light. And this also doesn't, even if it was the wife and kids, this doesn't match the hairy hand description that Ronald had gave them. So now they're kind of back to square one and looking right back at Ronald. Once they start looking into Ronald's past, they kind of are able to figure out a lot and are able to explain all these events. When they start looking into Ronald's past, they find out that he was really bad at keeping a job. I believe it was in the past 10 years or so, he went through 21 different jobs. He currently worked at an optical store where he was about to be let go because he had been accused of stealing money. So again, he's in a pretty rough situation. On top of that, they find out that he's not only about to get fired, but he is $100,000 in debt. His car was about to be repossessed. He had several bank loans, and his home was on the brink of being foreclosed. So now you're saying, okay, Ronald's really bad with money and really bad with jobs, but what does that have to do with Timothy or the Pixie Sticks or any of this? Turns out that Ronald had taken out life insurance policies on both of his kids for $10,000 each a few months ago. And then a month before Halloween, before all this happened with Timothy, he took out an additional $20,000 on each of the kids. Now each kid has a $30,000 life insurance policy in their name for a total of $60,000. Remember, his kids are 8 and 5. Nobody gets a life insurance policy. I'm not going to say nobody, but very few people get life insurance policies on their children. It's pretty weird, and most people don't want to think about their children's death in the first place. And then they find out the morning after Halloween, after his kid had just died in the hospital, Ronald had called the insurance company to see how he could get the money. People who were at the funeral say that Ronald talked about using that money to go on vacation, to get away from everything and to work on the grieving process, which is kind of weird for someone to say at their kid's funeral, to say that now they're going to go on vacation. But, to each their own, I guess, if that's how you grieve. When they talk to his wife, Danine, she tells the police that she didn't know about the life insurance. The only thing she knew about was the $10,000 policy that they created in the first place. But yes, she knew about it, but she originally objected to it. She did not want to get the life insurance policy, but Ronald really pushed for it. And then he went behind her back and got an extra $20,000 and found out that he took out that money immediately after his son died. She also goes on to testify in court that that night Timothy didn't actually even want the pixie stick, that he was planning on eating a lollipop, but Ronald insisted that he should have the pixie stick because the lollipop would take too long to eat and it was night and he had to go to sleep, so the pixie stick was the fastest thing. And he even helped open it for Timothy. So now all of this is really looking bad for Ronald, but it gets worse. It was said that Ronald was asking people questions about cyanide and how cyanide worked and how much cyanide would it take to kill somebody, and that he was asking people who are scientists, and it just came off very weird. Nobody really knew why, and it's just kind of coincidental that cyanide was the thing that killed his son. Police then get a tip from a local chemical supply store telling them that Ronald had came in the day before Halloween to ask about buying cyanide. Well, you can't really buy cyanide unless you have a specific license for it. And then even stores that, if you don't give them a license, they can only give you a very small amount. And it was a lot less than what Ronald was trying to get in the first place. Requested a lot more than what was in those pixie sticks. So with all this information, the police get a search warrant. They look through his house and they find a pair of scissors. Now, these scissors may have seemed insignificant at first, but when you really look at them, they find plastic residue that matches the same type of plastic that was on the pixie sticks that were opened and stapled shut. So on November 5th, they arrest Ronald, and he is indicted on 4 counts of attempted murder and 1 count of capital murder for the death of his son. Ronald pleads not guilty to all the charges, and he really remained adamant that he was not guilty. By the whole town, he became dubbed as the Candyman. It wasn't looking good for Ronald. Even though he said he wasn't guilty, his lawyer's case was really weak. Pretty much their entire defense consisted of a theory that there was someone else in the neighborhood who did it, and that they were focusing on the wrong person rather than this make-believe person who's out there trying to attack all of their children. It only took the jury 46 minutes before they decided that Ronald was guilty of all counts. They were not convinced by their story of this person who was out to get all the children. They weren't convinced. And then after a 71-minute deliberation, they decided to sentence Ronald to the death penalty. Ronald became so hated by everybody that he was referred to as the Candyman, or the man who ruined Halloween. He was so hated, in fact, that even the death row mates all shunned Ronald. Ronald's execution date kept getting moved and pushed back to multiple times. It was pushed 3 times until October 31st, 1982, where they were planning on executing him, which almost seemed kind of fitting to everyone, considering that that was the date that he killed Timothy. And the judge was so adamant about this date and was so adamant of getting justice for Timothy that he said that he was willing to drive Ronald to the prison himself to get him executed on that date. But the Supreme Court intervened, and they wanted to give Ronald and his team another try to appeal and get a new trial. And so that's what his attorneys did. They fought, they tried. They said that Ronald didn't do it, and that death by injection was a cruel and unusual punishment. And he really tried to maintain his innocence to the last moments. But, nobody was having that, because what else is a cruel and unusual punishment? Killing your son with cyanide. So he was set to get his death penalty on March 31st, 1984. And a crowd of about 300 people gathered outside the prison to cheer for his death. And they called him the Candyman. They shouted trick or treat and just all types of things to Ronald. In his last words, he said, quote, "What is about to transpire in a few days is wrong. However, we as human beings do make mistakes and errors. This execution is one of those wrong, yet doesn't mean our whole system of justice is wrong. Therefore, I would forgive all who have taken part in any way in my death. Also, to anyone I have offended in any way during my 39 years, I pray and ask for your forgiveness, just as I forgive anyone who offended me in any way. And I pray and ask God's forgiveness for all of us respectively as human beings. To my loved ones, I extend my undying love. To those close to me, know in your hearts I love you all. God bless you all, and may God's blessings be always yours." Unquote. So that was the end of Ronald and this whole case. As for his wife, Dianine, after this whole thing started happening, she divorced Ronald and later got remarried, and they left with her 1 kid, which is still awful to deal with, but at least she was able to move on with her life despite all of this. I don't know how you would ever trust anybody ever again after finding out that someone you loved was capable of something so horrific. But the only thing that came out of this case that I guess you can call a positive arose within all the thorns is that ever since this, yes, there have been so many cases of people finding needles and razor blades and whatever other crazy things in their candy, but there has never, at least not that I could find, there hasn't been a case of anyone getting injured or dying from this. So we all learned from this. Everyone learned from this. So it's hard to say that that's like something good came out of this because it was horrible, but at least no one else is dying from poison in their candy, and we're all looking out for anything suspicious. The only thing I still don't really understand about Ronald in this case is that he gave out 5 pixie sticks, right? 2 of them to his kids. We know why he gave them to his kids. He wanted to get that life insurance money. And then there was another 3 that he gave to Jimmy's kids and that kid from church. Jimmy was one of his, from what I could tell, him and Jimmy were very close friends. Not after this, clearly. But why would he give them to Jimmy's kids? Why would he give them to that boy from their church? We know that he gave them to Timothy and Elizabeth so he could take out the insurance money. But why did he want to poison 3 other innocent kids? Like, it was already awful enough. What was he going to gain by poisoning all the other kids? Not only that, but he didn't get the amount of cyanide he wanted. He only was able to get that amount because he didn't have a license. So how many was he planning to make? And what was he planning to do with all of them? And why? You know what I mean? It's so weird to think about. Why do people do what they do? That's what we're trying to figure out. But we'll never know because he's passed now. I don't know. Why do people do what they do? That's what we aim to figure out. But that'll be all for today. Thank you so much for tuning in to this week's episode of How Did We Get Here? Tune in next week for more stories where we ask the question again of how did we get here, and listen to more insane cases throughout history. Stay safe and have a great day. Bye.